5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Over.
What's the time go?
This is Stan Tinsley speaking. It's February 1, 1991. I'm speaking to Mr. Don MacKerer, K-E-R-E-R, in Knoxville, Tennessee, about his World War II experiences. MacKerer, when did you join the service?
Well, I enlisted in, I think, around the 1st of September of 1942 in what was known, I think, then as the Enlisted Reserve Corps. I was not called up until March of 1943. I was a twin. And,
oh, really?
Yes, and my brother was with me throughout the service until he was killed during the Battle of the Bulge.
Oh, is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Oh. So they did keep you two together?
Yes, if you requested that they would keep you together. You were given the choice, if I recall. That's been a while ago, of course. But I remember that if you so requested, you stayed together. And we did. We were in the same battalion in different companies.
Okay.
Although, strangely enough, the day after he was killed, his company lost all the platoon leaders, and we were asked from my company to send one of our guys over there, and I said, well, I'll go over there because I know the personnel better than anybody else. And I ended up taking over his platoon, which was kind of a strange experience both for me and for the men.
I bet. Did you knew that he was dead at that time?
No, not at that time. He'd been wounded, and the word didn't get back to us for about 2 or 3 days after that.
I see.
So at that time I did not know he was dead. I knew he'd been wounded, but did not know that he died of wounds.
What do you remember about leaving home?
Of course, I was in college when we were called to active duty, but I had been away to prep school for 2 years, so leaving home was not a trauma for me.
Not a big shock to you?
No, it was not. I don't recall any trauma associated with it at all. We had traveled a lot as a family and as kids. My father used to send us out to the East Coast where my mother's family lived every summer, so we were used to traveling. And leaving home, I don't recall at all as being traumatic.
Okay. Your brother was in the service. Anyone else from your family in the service?
No, just my brother and I. I had a younger brother, but he was too young for the service.
You went in. Describe to me your training that you received in the States.
We were inducted at Scottsfield, Illinois, which is outside of St. Louis, Missouri, and then shipped to Camp Roberts, California, where we took infantry basic training, which was a 17-week cycle. During that time, we applied for officer candidate school and were accepted. So I suppose we got out of the basic training about July and went to OCS August, September, October, November at Fort Benning. Graduated at the end of November 1943.
Okay. And what happened?
We were assigned to the 80th Infantry Division, which was on a desert maneuver in the California-Arizona maneuver area, which is outside of Yuma. And I think that was probably maybe a 4-month effort, at which time the division was sent east to stage at Fort Dix, New Jersey. This would have been in the spring of 1944. We were shipped out as replacements. I think the Army, in anticipation of heavy casualties in Europe, pulled a lot of officers out of staging units and shipped them over seas as replacements. And my brother and I were pulled out and sent over as replacements to England.
You were sent overseas. What did you think of the quality of the training that you received in the States as far as?
Well, I thought the training we got at Fort Benning was probably the finest academic exposure I'd ever seen or been subjected to. I thought that infantry school was so well run and so efficiently structured that it was an amazingly good operation. The division we joined in California-Arizona maneuver was I guess it had been a National Guard unit, if I recall, or reserve, whatever. And they were basically of draftees with a cadre of probably regular Army people. And I suppose they were like all units of that kind. They were probably disorganized.
Mm-hmm.
I was later glad that I did not go into combat with them, but rather had joined a seasoned outfit, because I'm sure they got chewed up pretty good the first couple of weeks until they learned what they were doing.
We'll see.
You know, I think they were okay. All those units were, I suppose, in a way, there's no way you can truly prepare anybody for combat.
Right.
Through training. I mean, the experience is so shattering that no matter how much training you do, you're not really prepared for somebody to actually shoot at you.
Right. Tell me again what units you were part of, and what were your duties?
Well, I was a rifle platoon leader in the 39th Infantry Regiment of the 9th Infantry Division.
Sort of what you had expected your assignment would be, something similar to that?
Well, Fort Benning, of course, the infantry OCS basically trains you as to be a platoon leader.
Mm-hmm.
If you had a skill that you had acquired perhaps in an earlier Army experience, like the mortars or machine guns or ammunition and pioneer platoon, they would perhaps assign you to something other than a rifle platoon. But basically, that was where my experience was in a rifle platoon, and that's what I ended up doing. Unfortunately, that, of course, is the bottom end of the ladder as far as it relates to being in the most dangerous exposure you can have.
To get the dates here, when did you leave the United States, and when did you get back?
I don't remember the exact dates, Stan. I left in early June, if I recall, left the States and got in England probably around the middle of, or latter part of June. And then I think we came ashore in Normandy the middle part of July. I want to say, I know it was before St. Lo, which I think was the 21st, if I recall. So we would have probably been like the third week in July.
Okay. Just give me your overseas experiences, I guess, from beginning to the end. Maybe we're better done that way.
The hedgerow country in France, of course, was a very different sort of a place to fight than open ground would have been. I don't know if you've ever been in Normandy, but
No, I haven't.
the farms in France are relatively small because, unlike England, they divide, when a father dies, he gives his land equally to his children, and that's had a tendency through the years to compartmentalize the farms into much smaller acreage, as opposed to the way the British and the Swiss do, where the first son gets everything. So the French farms in those days, in particular, were small, and they would divide the fields up by what they called hedgerows, which were mounds of earth that would raise 4 or 5 feet in the air and be several feet thick. And they acted as fences, but they were great as defensive positions because you'd have to cross these open areas between these hedgerows, and it was a very, very difficult place in which to fight. We got out of Normandy and the land opened up, of course, after the push at St. Lo. The Germans more or less began the retreat across France back into Germany, and we pretty much just chased them. They'd fight rear guard action, but that was relatively light action for us in comparison to what we'd had in the hedgerow country in France. You know, of course, a welcome relief. We bypassed Paris. We went to the east of it and crossed the Seine River at a little town called Melun, and then moved into through northern France and into Belgium. And as we got into Belgium, we began to meet heavier resistance, and culminating with the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest, which was a very, very difficult, very, very difficult place to fight because it was thick pine woods. Sometimes you couldn't see more than 50 yards in front of you, and it was very heavy casualties in that area. We were there were a series of dams called the Ruhr River ran through there, and we were trying to get at those dams because if we thought if we could take the dams, not only could we disrupt their electrical power, but we could also flood them downstream from the Ruhr River dams. Knowing that, the Germans fiercely defended that area, and we took heavy casualties through there, and had been pulled back from there sometime around the first part of November, and kind of put in reserve to literally regroup. We had to bring in a lot of replacements because of the exorbitantly high number of casualties we took. And then we moved north and relieved the 1st Infantry Division between a little outside of a town called Duren, D-U-R-E-N, that was on the Aachen Plain between the city of Aachen and Cologne. And the objective was eventually to drive to the Rhine River and Cologne. We were advancing on Duren when the Battle of the Bulge broke, and we were pulled out of that engagement to go south to anchor the northern shoulder of the Battle of the Bulge, which we did. And we were near a town called Monschau, M-O-N-C-H-A-U, if I recall it. Oh, I guess about a month and a half down there altogether. A lot of it in basically a defensive position. Now, like the first or second day we got down there, we dug in along a ridge, and each battalion sent out a patrol to go out until they made contact with the Germans in order to gauge how close they were to us. And my brother caught the patrol that went out from our battalion, and he was fatally wounded on that patrol. And he hit us the next night with a frontal assault and pushed us back a little bit. At that time, I was in F Company, and they were in reserve. And it was that night that E Company lost all 3 of their platoon leaders, if I remember right. And commander called down to F Company and said to our company commander, Captain Holiday, he said, "You got to send one of your platoon leaders over to E Company." And so he called us all together and he said, "One of you has got to go over to E Company." And I said, "Well, I'll go because I know the people over there." And that was when I went over to E Company. Stayed pretty much in a defensive position. We did a little patrolling through that time. And then at the end of January, we launched an assault to go through the Siegfried Line again. Came through that Monschau area, and I was wounded again on that, and went back to England and spent the next 3 months in the hospital in England, and came back just as the war was over. So I missed the last campaign. In effect, I made the first 4 campaigns, but missed the last campaign by being in England. It was a wonderful time. I had a delightful time. It was the nicest time I had in the army because I wasn't wounded that badly. It just took a while to heal.
Well, that can happen sometimes.
Hoped it never would.
I spoke to after you say you got back right at the end of the war, right back with your outfit. Did you spend any time after the war in
I
Germany?
stayed a year in occupation, which I enjoyed. I thought that was that was an interesting experience. Unfortunately, I was still very young. I was still only, I guess I was 20 when the war got over. And I was very content to lay around area and drink liquor and chase women. But I did have some interesting experiences. I was part of a team that discharged German prisoners, wounded prisoners from hospitals, and that was kind of an interesting experience because we had to interview them, and I were a medic, and I had to sign the discharges. They had to have a commissioned officer sign the discharges, and that was virtually my only function. The interpreter would ask them questions. They were primarily screening them for SS people because the SS people were considered in prisoner of war compounds for some time after the war. But the regular rank-and-file German soldiers, they tried to get them out of the army as soon as possible. And I was on one of those teams that went around discharge. It's kind of an interesting experience, but Bavaria is a lovely country.
I'm sure so.
And And I didn't go back to the States, I guess, until May of 1946.
46.
Yeah.
Still hear from fellows that you served with over
Oh,
there?
absolutely, yeah. I hear from my old battalion commander, my company commander, and leaders that I served with. And I occasionally go to a division reunion, although I'm not so gung-ho that I would go every year.
Right.
A lot of the fellows just think that's the greatest thing that ever happened, is to go back there, but for me, it doesn't hold that much of a thrill.
Right. What do you remember most about your time overseas?
Of course, it was sharply divided between combat and the occupational duties. About combat is being scared to death most of the time. I'd like to say that I was a big-time hero, but I was anything but that. I was scared spitless most of the time. Somehow you function, and with responsibility you have to.
Did your unit take prisoners? Take in prisoners?
Oh yeah, we took prisoners all the time.
What did you think of?
The Germans? They varied, Stan. Some of them were wonderful soldiers. It depended on the unit. Toward the end, they got a little ragtag because they, had been decimated by this time. Surprisingly enough, we ran into some Russians. Apparently, early on in the war, when the Germans went to the Ukraine, some of the Russians were sympathetic to them, and they pulled them into the German army. And what they would do, they would intersperse them with their own people. They didn't have command positions. I never saw any of them that weren't just regular riflemen. And they were quick to surrender if you got them in a situation where they could gracefully surrender. And I can remember that they used to say, "Nick shoots me Ruski," which means "Don't shoot, I'm Russian." But again, the SS units, on those rare occasions we ran into them, were fierce and very, very good soldiers. And some of the regular Army units were very good, but toward the end, and this was confirmed more by the fellow when I got back, they were, the trick toward the end of the war was to get them in a position where they could surrender gracefully. It began to happen in the spring after we broke out of the Bulge.
How did you get along with the German civilians?
Okay, my father was Swiss, so I could speak a little German, and I'd heard it spoken all my life, so I picked it up fairly quickly. Now, of course, immediately after the war, we weren't allowed to fraternize. They had the fraternization rules. So it was probably several months after the war was over before we were really allowed to talk to German civilians. But after that, I had no problems with them at all. The interesting things I recall about World War II as it related to the way the American soldier reacted to the Europeans was at that time, France was a lot less sophisticated than it is now so far as plumbing and the niceties and the standard of living. Their standard of living was much lower than it is now. Now they live very well over there. But when we, of course, went through France, and their farmlands and rural areas were pretty crude in many respects. But when we got into Germany, the standard of living was noticeably higher. The plumbing was better, they had better radios, they had furniture, and the American soldier could relate to the German way of living much better than he could the French. And I remember some of the soldiers, not really understanding what the hell they were over there for, saying, "What are we fighting these guys for? They're more like us than the frogs." They looked upon the French as, as being kind of backward and sloppy, and that I recall thinking that was an irony of the war, that the average American soldier almost related more to the Germans
over and over again
than they did the French.
Did you have any contact with Allied troops?
No, not directly. We always had American forces on either side of us. Now, after the war, we had some exchange between ourselves and the British. We had a British officer come down and visit, spend a couple of weeks with our unit, and we sent an officer up to his unit. But that was really the only exchange I had.
I see.
I saw some of them in England, of course, when I was over
Mhm.
there on several occasions.
What do you think of the British in general? Well,
I had a tendency to think that they didn't necessarily pull their own weight. But some of that, I think, was born of the fact that for them it had been an awful lot longer war than for us, and they had taken casualties in the Far East, the Mid-East, and they had been at it a long time. And they were, I think, more cautious as it related to making shoot it all out frontal assaults than we were, because they didn't have the personnel, for one thing. And we had a tendency to think Marshal Montgomery just went up into Holland, sat on his butt. That was the general opinion, I think, that the average American soldier had. Whether that was justified or not, I don't know.
did you have any particular feelings about the people of draft age that didn't go in the service?
Know that I felt wild about it. You know, there was an element called 4Fs.
Right.
But they apparently had physical disabilities. I think we had a universal dislike of what was known as a draft dodger. But I didn't spend that much time out of the darn Army, to tell you the truth. From the time I was 18 years old, I was pretty much involved, and I really never did any garrison soldiering. I was always in the field. I didn't know what the hell it was to like sleep in a bed, unless we took a German town.
You think the war changed you?
Oh, it was bound to have. I mean, at that age, and have that much responsibility at that age, I think it was the most formative thing of my life. I think what I am today reflects on the war.
Think it changed the country?
I'm sure it must have. Yeah. Yes. If only because it caused people from different regions to go to other regions. We were much more colloquial, I think, before World War II than we were afterwards.
So many of the people who had just never been outside their home city or county or state.
And that was particularly true in the South.
Right. What do you remember most about coming home?
My parents I think I believe I had time to call them from New York. It was off the boat and on the train. And the separation center that I went to was in Camp Atterbury in Indiana, and calling Atterbury to tell her to come pick me up in Detroit. I started originally to surprise them, and I thought, you know, that's kind of cruel. She'd have to fall over and faint. So I waited until I got to Camp Atterbury to call him. I called up and said, "Mama," and she said, "Where are you?" I said, I'm going to get into Detroit on such and such a train, and of course she let out this hoot.
You were much younger than the average soldier or officer in particular, weren't you?
Yeah.
Oh, what younger?
Yeah. I was 19, just barely 19 when I got commissioned. I didn't look like a kid, so it was never a problem for me. Some people that were, 4 or 5 years older than I were, looked a lot younger than I did. But nobody ever questioned my brother and I, or you guys were awful young to be officers, because we didn't look that young. Very frank.
That was probably a
Yeah, it was.
This is a funny question to me, but I'm going to ask it because you get some. Could we have done better during the war?
Well, I think the thing that I personally most resented was the fact that we did not have smokeless powder for our small arms. So that every time you fired your weapon, there was a puff of smoke came out the muzzle of that weapon. And the Germans could see that, of course.
Yeah.
And it made us much more vulnerable to a return fire, because they use smokeless powder. And I've been,
I didn't know that.
Oh yeah, I've been from here to that wall from a machine gun, and not been able to see where it was. I knew it was in the area, and was kind of off to one side. It wasn't shooting at me. Obviously, I would have been deader than Henry's hammer, but you couldn't see it. what would give it away occasionally was that the blast would move the foliage, the muzzle blast, but there was no smoke. But every time a soldier fired his gun, there was a puff of smoke come out the muzzle, and it used to piss me off something awful to see us not have smokeless powder and the Germans with smokeless powder.
I didn't know that.
Yeah,
I'll be honest.
I carry that resentment to this day.
I can see why.
We had, I thought, weapon superiority with the exception of the light machine gun. They had a much better light machine gun than we did. Their MG-34s and MG-42s were much better weapons than our light machine guns were. And our heavy machine guns were a pain in the neck because they were just very, very heavy.
Mm-hmm.
You couldn't lug them, or they weren't very portable. They were fine for defensive positions, but we weren't a defensive army. And they were a son of a gun to love.
What is it the German, is it an artillery piece or a mortar or what, 88 that you always hear about?
Well, that was their 88 millimeter cannon, which was originally designed as an anti-aircraft weapon,
Mm-hmm.
and was used throughout the war as an anti-aircraft weapon. It was converted into a ground weapon in the desert campaign in North Africa because it had a very high muzzle velocity and was a terrific anti-tank weapon. It was used spasmodically against us. It had the advantage of a very flat trajectory, and you could direct fire it. Now, if you were in a situation where you had a lava shell, it was useless. You had to have direct observation to use that thing, but it would absolutely terrify you because you couldn't hear it coming. See, with the average artillery shell, you got a little bit of time because you can hear it before it gets there, and you can at least take some cover. But with an 88, it was on you before you knew anything. It already detonated. I was only under 88 fire once, and that was quite enough.
That's it. I think the war changed the country politically.
Well, I wasn't, of course, so aware of the politics of the country before the war because I was relatively young. I was a senior in high school when Pearl Harbor came. It united the country as never before. World War II, I think, was the most unifying thing that ever happened to this country, and we've never been that united before or afterwards. And it didn't last too long. We got back to being Republicans and Democrats in short order.